Right. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome back to day 3 of our Civil Rights Conference. Of course, brought to you by the National Archives and the National Park Service. A few housekeeping things before we get started for the day. First of all, once again, if you are a teacher and you're joining us virtually, please make sure that you put your name or your email address in the comments so that we are sure to, or in the chat, so that we are sure to give you your credit for attending. A few things that I have not talked about since we started is that as we go through all of this, primary source documents are very important. And so we have Docs Teach with the National Park Service, not the National Park Service, the National Archives rather. Docs Teach that you can find online, where we have a number of primary resources that you can take advantage of, as well as within our individual presidential libraries. As well, I want to direct your attention. Part of our sponsor, one of the sponsors for this event is the Eisenhower Memorial Commission, and they created a website that you can find, or webpage that you can find on the Eisenhower Foundation's website. That is a timeline of not only civil rights, but also the Eisenhower administration within civil rights. So please go visit that. It is a great resource. As usual, is she back? Yep. We are going to start our morning off with a brief presentation from StoryCorps. So Emily, I am going to turn that over to you.
Amazing. Good morning, Joy. Sorry, I just had a little internet mishap right before this. So hopefully we are good to go this morning. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to greet the day with you each morning of this conference. And as Joy said, I have another story to share from StoryCorps this morning. At StoryCorps, everyday people like you, like me, come together to record our personal memories to pass down for future generations in our families and communities beyond via our archive at the Library of Congress. So in this story, we hear about someone who you may have heard of. Physicist Ronald E. McNair was the second African-American person to enter space. He was on board the NASA Challenger mission in 1986, which ended tragically when the shuttle exploded after takeoff. Years later, his brother Carl came to StoryCorps to remember him when he was a little kid with big dreams in Lake City, South Carolina. We'll see what happened when he tried to access his local public library to fuel his budding scientific curiosity with books. Let's watch. Oh my God, I lost it.
When he was 9 years old, Ron, without my parents or myself knowing his whereabouts, decided to take a mile walk from our home down to the library, which was, of course, public library, but not so public for black folks when you're talking about 1959. So as he was walking in there, all these folks were staring at him because they were white folk only, and they were looking at him and said, who's this Negro? So he politely positioned himself in line to check out his books. Well, this old librarian, she says, this library is not for coloreds. He said, well, I would like to check out these books. She says, young man, if you don't leave this library right now, I'm going to call the police. So he just propped himself up on the counter and sat there and said, I'll wait. So she called the police and subsequently called my mother. Police came down, 2 burly guys come in and say, well, where's the disturbance? And she pointed to the little 9-year-old boy sitting up on the counter. He says, man, what's the problem? So my mother, in the meanwhile, she was called. She comes down there praying the whole way there. Lord Jesus, please don't let them put my child in jail. And my mother asked the librarian, what's the problem? Well, he wanted to check out the books, and your son shouldn't be down here. And the police officer said, why don't you just give the kid the books? And my mother said, he'll take good care of them. And reluctantly, the librarian gave Ron the books. And my mother said, what did you say? He said, thank you, ma'am. Later on, as youngsters, a show came on TV called Star Trek. Now, Star Trek showed the future where there were black folk and white folk working together.
Right.
And I looked at it as science fiction because that wasn't going to happen, really. But Ronald saw it as science possibility. He came up during a time when there was Neil Armstrong and all of those guys. So how was a colored boy from South Carolina wearing glasses, never flew a plane, how was he going to become an astronaut? But Ron was the one who didn't accept societal norms as being his norm. I mean, that was for other people. And he got to be aboard his own Starship Enterprise.
Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you, StoryCorps. We will have a brief I'll just do a brief overview of the day, and then we'll take a short break, and then we'll start right at 10 o'clock. At 10 o'clock, we'll welcome Dr. Valerie Mendoza, who will talk about Beyond Brown, Mexican Struggles for Equality Before and After Brown v. Board. We will take a break at 11 o'clock for lunch. And then we will welcome Cheryl Brown Henderson at noon as our keynote speaker. And then we will have, if you're on site, you'll have a tour of your facility wherever you are. And then we will be on break until about 6:30. Well, at least virtually we'll be on break until 6:30, where we will come back and be live from the Clinton Presidential Library, where we will have a panel discussion with the New Orleans 4 and the North Little Rock 6. So right now we are going to take a break, and we will see you back here at 10 a.m. If you're virtual, you'll start getting on at 9:55. That way we'll be able to start right on time. Right. All right, welcome back. We will be getting started right here at 10 with Dr. Mendoza. Once again, I just want to remind any teachers that are joining us virtually to put either your name or your email addresses in the chat so that we can make sure to give you credit for your attendance. With that said, we are pleased to welcome our first speaker for today, Dr. Valerie Mendoza, who is going to tell us a little bit about Beyond Brown. What's Beyond Brown? So welcome, Dr. Mendoza.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate the invitation. I'm super excited to talk to you about Beyond Brown, Mexican struggles for equality. And it's really poignant for me to be doing it here in the Brown v. Board site. So what do you think about when you think about segregation, right? We think about, obviously separate schools. Slide, please. We think about things like separate water fountains. We think about, separate bathrooms, separate entrances, sitting in the back of the bus, right? But segregation affected those of us who were brown as well. Next slide. This is a sign from Texas, but it was not one that was uncommon in other places where there were Mexican communities. My grandparents would tell me stories about having to take carryout out of the back door of a restaurant because they weren't allowed in. So my grandpa told this story. He was very light complected and he had gray eyes, and so he walked into a restaurant where there was a sign similar to this, and he ordered his meal. They gave it to him, and then he started talking to them in rapid fire Spanish so that they would know that, hey, you just served someone who's Mexican. And then he ran out of there as fast as he could before they could call the police. So things like that. The only day that Mexicans were allowed to swim in the city pool, the public pool, was the day before the water was changed. They had to sit in balconies in the movie theaters. So this is this next slide is a slide of downtown Topeka, and that's one of the movie theaters that was there. They even had separate schools for Mexican children in the larger cities here in Kansas. Next, please. So this photo is of the Branner Elementary School. And right next to it was a school specifically for Mexican children called Branner Annex. As we know, and as we're all here for today, the most famous event to end segregation in schools and eventually all public places nationwide was a lawsuit by several families in Topeka called a Brown v. Board of Education. That now famous ruling that that separate schools weren't inherently unequal took place in 1954, and schools across the country were told to desegregate with all deliberate speed. But the Brown case wasn't the beginning or end of segregation, especially for those of us of Mexican descent, and especially those of us who live in Kansas and the United States. So this is next. This is a little timeline of cases in Kansas and throughout the country. And you can see, sorry, folks in Arkansas and elsewhere, I have this Kansas bias, and this talk will mostly be about Kansas, but started this timeline with a very little known but important, it wasn't a court case, it was an incident, and I'll be talking about it here in a minute, with several families in Kansas City, Kansas. There were cases in California, in particular, the Lemon Grove incident, Mendez v. Westminster, which was a precursor to Brown, and the lawyers from Brown used many of the similar arguments of West Mendez. So both the Lemon Grove incident and the Alvarado incidents were very local. Mendez worked at the state level, and then we have, of course, Brown at the national level. There were also Mexican organizations that sprang up for civil rights. The League of United Latin American Citizens, for example, was one. It was founded in Texas in 1929. Soon had chapters all across the country, including here in Kansas and Topeka in particular. So what I'm going to do today is I am going to talk to you about school segregation, again, throughout Kansas. And then what I want to do is I want to talk to you about resistance to that segregation and cultural thriving. And then I'll open it up for questions. I'd love to learn from you folks, both in person and online, about experiences of segregation that you might have had. So first up, I want to talk about the Kansas City case that I mentioned, not case, but incident that I mentioned with Saturnino Alvarado. So in Kansas, many of the larger school districts, larger cities had a tri-racial school system. Okay, so there were schools for whites, there were schools for Blacks, and then there were schools for Mexican children at the elementary level. And if there weren't separate schools, if a school district wasn't large enough to have a separate school, they often had, a separate room for Mexican children, where they were taught in basements, or in a building that was on school grounds but not part of the actual school. Anglo parents began objecting to their children mixing with Mexican children. There's some speculation that the 1918 flu pandemic might have had something to do with this. Even today, there's rhetoric that immigrants bring disease, right? And so lots of immigrants coming, particularly to Kansas during the 1910 period due to the Mexican Revolution, chaos in Mexico, people needing jobs. Here in this country, we had workers going off to war for World War I. So Mexicans were brought into Kansas to work for the railroad. And Anglo parents, as I mentioned, feared this mixing. So in 1922, in Kansas City, Kansas, next slide, there was a petition by white parents for a separate Mexican elementary school. And that's what you see here. This is the Clara Barton School. It opened in 1923. And it was a 3-room annex on the grounds of another school for Mexican children, on the grounds of another school for white children. This school was for Mexican children. 1924 saw another segregated elementary school for Mexican children in Kansas City, Kansas, and yet a third the following year. As you can see in this photo, there's no playground equipment. The school also had no kindergarten. Summer school was provided by, the Methodist Mission in the city. So in Kansas City, as elsewhere, Mexican children were treated very much like African American children in terms of separate facilities, discriminatory treatment, social inequality. And, one of the reasons that, other than, not wanting to mix, that one of the arguments given for these separate schools was lack of English skills, right? These children don't speak English. They're going to hold our kids back. They need to be Americanized. They should be in, separate schools. So this was the reasoning. But lots of these schools were not, were lacking, right? There was one school in Kansas City who had only 5 teachers, and that included the principal. In some cases, like when there was a school, Mexican school next to a white school, literal lines were drawn on the playground to keep Mexican children separate from their Anglo counterparts. Next slide, please. Students were spanked for speaking Spanish, or their hands were hit with a ruler. Names were changed, Maria to Mary. My own grandmother had her name changed in school from Jesusa to Hazel. And it wasn't unusual for students to be singled out for harassment by teachers. In Newton, Kansas in the 1920s, Mexican children were not encouraged to attend public schools and stayed away in large numbers until a Spanish-speaking nurse persuaded the parents of about 45 students to enroll in the elementary school. But what happened was this swelled the numbers of the elementary school, and it's a small town, so much so that the teacher, the white teacher, threatened to quit. And so this nurse, this white Spanish-speaking nurse, taught those 45 students in Spanish for 3 years until that practice was abolished, and eventually Mexican students were allowed to attend the elementary school. Next slide. In Dodge City, Kansas, they had students there. There was a law there that students' hair had to be cut a certain length before they could attend school. But the barbers discriminated and would not cut hairs of Mexican students. So there was a man in the Mexican Village, which what the neighborhood where Mexican students lived in Dodge City was called, and he started cutting hair of the children's hair so that they could attend school. But he was arrested because he was doing that without a license. And so he went put in jail. He came before a judge, explained what he was doing, why he was doing. Luckily had a sympathetic judge who said, you know what, you can't discriminate barbers. You have to cut everyone's hair. You can't do that. Students in Dodge City also attended an all-Mexican school. It was called the Coronado School, beginning in 1915, and that school was open until 1947. That school, incidentally, was funded privately and was built using private monies. It was on the land of the Santa Fe Railroad. Again, Mexican workers came to Kansas to work in the railroad. And it had 2 rooms and 1 teacher for grades 1 through 3. So in 1923, some education students and professors from the University of Kansas came to observe Dodge City schools. And they went to the Coronado School, and they assumed that the school was temporary because it was so inadequate. So this is 1923, right? So the school had opened in 1915. So this is, like several years later. And they noted that, quote, the school was wholly impossible with such facilities to provide satisfactory elementary instruction. The 1923, remember when I told you the school closed? 1947. So it operated for 2 more decades, this wholly inadequate school. And actually, one of the only reasons that it came down was because the Santa Fe Railroad wanted that property back for use to put up a building for itself. When students were finally allowed to attend public school in Dodge City, they were separated, as I mentioned, as often done, but they were separated into the special education classrooms because they were assumed that one, they assumed they couldn't speak English, right? And two, because they couldn't speak English, they must have some, learning disabilities, right? So their, education consisted back then of crayons, scissors, and a pad of paper. So there was an oral history done with a student who went through this school and was being taught this way, but he eventually got out and put into a classroom with other students. And this is the reason why. So he got detention for acting out for something, and his punishment was to sweep the hallways in the school after school. That was his detention. So he was doing this one day, and the principal walked by and started a conversation with this student. And the principal realized, wow, the student speaks perfect English. Why is he in this, separate classroom? And put the student in the right in the classroom for his grade level. The student eventually left that elementary school, went on to junior high, and graduated from high school. But if it weren't for that chance meeting, that student would never have followed that path of education. So most students, the reason it was only elementary schools that were segregated, because back in this time period, first half of the 20th century, students often left school after receiving an elementary education. They either needed to work to help support the family income, or they were needed in the home to help with other children, things like that. So in Topeka, as I mentioned, the Branner Annex was a school for Mexican children. And let me describe it for you. And as I do this, I want you to remember that one of the linchpins of using Brown as a case was that the schools were equal. Right? The schools were essentially on par. The facilities were the same, if not better. They received, they had excellent teachers. The class size were on par with the white students, right? So, here's a description of the Mexican school in Topeka. And this description came in 1932, and it was from the principal. And he said that Branner Annex consisted of 4 portable rooms and 2 old brick toilet buildings. All Mexican public school children attended this school through the 3rd grade, by which time it was hoped that they would have sufficient mastery of English to proceed to rooms in the regular Branner School, which I showed you a photo of before, or Lincoln School, which was in a nearby public school. None of the teachers had any special training for this type of work, and none of them spoke Spanish. So with no teacher training, right, and an inability to communicate, this is a prolonged period of linguistic and educational transition, right? So And this, so there were public schools that were segregated, but there were also private schools, Catholic schools in particular, that began catering to Mexican students. This was the case in Topeka. This was the case in Wichita, some of the larger cities. I think, Newton might have had a Catholic school that was for Mexican children in particular. And in Topeka, this school was called Our Lady of Guadalupe School, and it was affiliated with Our Lady of Guadalupe Church. And this school began in 1920 and was taught by the Sisters of Charity from Leavenworth, Kansas. Decades later, one of the sisters who taught there was interviewed, and she remembered this, quote, "There are about 40 beginners. I don't know how I managed to teach them because only 12 of the number understood a word of English." That next year, that number had doubled, and children were crowded to a desk that was made for one, right? They were taught in one large room. So if you think maybe of your high school gym, something like that. And it was partitioned by curtains to separate grades 1 through 3 from grades 4 through 6. And we all know how boisterous and loud kids can be, right? And how hard it is just to keep their attention, right? But when you can hear through the curtain, the classroom next door, you can imagine the chaos. As the sisters said, sometimes they would go outside and sit on the stairs and teach class out there. 5 years later, the number of students had ballooned to 265 with just 4 teachers, right? So that's 60-something students per teacher. One nun recalled that, quote, "Each year the sisters have to have help from their friends in order to supply 1 book for every 2 children. They are grateful to get even second-hand books." So this school building, this overcrowded conditions, continued until 1951 when the school was condemned. And the only reason it was condemned was because here there was a huge flood in 1951 that wiped out, a lot of the Mexican neighborhoods and went through this one in particular as well, and kind of pretty much destroyed it. So a new school was needed, right? A new Catholic school was needed. And so what the parish priest did, who was a white priest, he convinced local businessmen to pay for building a new school. And his argument was, in trying to get these businessmen to hand over some money, he was like, you know what? This new private school, it's going to save taxpayers money because we're keeping Mexican kids from attending public school and using public school monies. And he was successful. The new school opened in 1953. So these are some of the things, some of the issues of, segregation, some of the stories, that I've collected about this. But now I want to turn to agency and resistance, because this type of treatment, the segregation, the discrimination, it wasn't taken lying down. So now I'm going to turn to Saturnino Alvarado, who I mentioned in the very beginning. So in 1925, so we're talking 2 decades before Brown, Saturnino Alvarado tried to enroll his 2 children, Jesus and Luz, so 1 son and 1 daughter, into Argentine high school, along with 2 other families. So 4 children altogether tried to enroll in Argentine high school. They actually got in the first day. But when parents found out about this, they objected to their presence, right? So the petition idea had worked before to open the separate Mexican elementary school. So they did this again. And the Anglo parents presented a petition of several hundred signatures to the school board to remove the children. But the school board refused, right? This is just 4 kids. We can't build a separate high school for 4 kids, right? That's not monetarily feasible. And again, remember how I mentioned that there are fewer students at high school level because they're either leaving to go to work or they're needed in housing. So what the school board did instead was it authorized a separate room for these 4 children in the high school. And Saturnino Alvarado and the other parents were like, no, we do not want our children taught in a separate room. We want them to get the same education as every other student. So the school board came back and they said, okay, you know what? Instead of putting them in another room, here's what we're going to do. We are going to pay for the students' transportation across state line into Missouri to go to a school there. You know, they won't be segregated. And the parents were like, why would we send our school into Missouri across state lines when there's a school right in my neighborhood that our children could attend? No, we want them to attend this school. So this led to a threat of violence against the Mexican students. And the Mexican parents actually withdrew their students from school in protest. 1, to protect them, but 2, to protest what, that the school board wouldn't let their kids in school and teach them, in the same manner that every other student was taught. So the parents lodged a complaint with the Mexican consul. So at this time in the 1920s, Kansas City had a large enough of a population that there was a Mexican consul in the city. And the parents eventually kept their students out of school for a whole year while all of this was going on. So here's the thing about this case incident. So you remember how I told you that separate elementary schools were built with the justification that these students can't speak English, right? All 4 of these students had gone to that elementary school, Clara Barton Elementary School. And they learned and they knew English. They spoke perfect English. So parents could not use this linguistic deficiency argument, right? And so the Mexican consul, he complained. And in October, the state attorney general of Kansas started talking with the Wyandotte County attorney to work out something. Quote, the rights of friendly aliens are to be protected. And the attorney general wanted the Wyandotte County attorney to, quote, correct the condition that exists in Wyandotte County. So there are newspaper articles. This is how we know this is going on, right? There are newspaper articles. Word is getting out that this is something, right? The Wyandotte, so what happens here is that the Mexican consul complains to the Wyandotte County attorney and to the state attorney, and the state attorney is like, you know what, this is not our issue. This is a county issue. The county attorney is like, this is a school board issue. So the buck is being passed around. Nobody wants to get involved in this, but the parents are persistent, right? They want their children to get this education. So eventually the Mexican consul in Kansas City lets the ambassador from Mexico know what's going on. And so now we're in Washington, D.C. Okay, so this is how this incident is going. So the Mexican embassy complains to the United States State Department. The Mexican embassy took the stand that school segregation violates treaties between the U.S. and Mexico. And they also argued that the school board should pay for police protection for the students so that the students can go to school. So this is escalating to an international incident. And meanwhile, on the ground, the students and the parents are threatened with truancy, right, for keeping their kids out of school. Eventually, what happens after months and months of back and forth, this passing the buck, is the State Department says that, according to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and for those of you who remember your history, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is the treaty that ends the Mexican-American War in 1848. Okay, so we're referring to a treaty that is, 80 years old. Mexicans are considered white. Therefore, these students should be able to go to this school because they are classified as white. So, the following fall, the Alvarado children and one of the others, Marcos de Leon, are admitted to Argentine high school. The fourth student in their family, they're like, you know what, forget it. It's not worth it. And we know this because Marcos de Leon was listed in the starting lineup of the football team in October. And all three graduated 4 years later in 1930. And there is no record that following fall in 1926 of any protests of anything happening. The students entered high school practically without incidents. Eventually, Marcos de Leon would go on to play football at the college level for Baker University, also here in Kansas. And there's a story that goes, and I haven't been able to confirm it, but I love to tell it because it's so awesome. There's a story that goes, he taught his fellow football players Spanish so that they could learn their plays in Spanish, so the other team wouldn't know what plays were being called. So schools, next slide, please. But also, cultural resistance took other forms. And here's our Lady of Guadalupe school in 6th grade. Next slide. So schools also took, resistance also took the form of cultural celebration, right? So this is a photo of from 1943 of the royalty from Topeka's Mexican fiesta. So Topeka the Topeka Mexican community started a fiesta in 1933. They needed to raise money to pay for an electric bill in the church. And so there's music, dancing, food, carnival games, all that sort of things. And it was so much fun. The Mexican community had so much fun, just gathering and celebration, that they decided to do it again. And so it became this yearly thing. And in 1939, they started a royalty contest. And so queen candidates were asked to raise money, and that money would also go to the church. And this year, 1943, they sold tickets for a nickel each. And the woman in the middle who was queen is my grandmother. Hazel Gomez was her maiden name. And you'll notice that she, even though her name was changed by her school teachers, she kept it. And she actually legally changed her name to Hazel. Side note on that, her mother, my great-grandmother, never, ever addressed her as Hazel. So that was my great-grandmother's act of resistance. But my grandmother, she won the queen contest by selling the most tickets. And part of it was because she had been doing some volunteer work with the YWCA here in town in Topeka. And she organized a group of Mexican young women who served soldiers that were in town for training. It was called the Y Senoritas Club. And so she sold all her tickets to the soldiers that were in town. So this celebration, as I mentioned, it occurred every year. It went from 3 days to 5 days. It's still in existence. It occurs every year in July. We're on year 91 right now, but that, is a form of resistance and cultural pride. And now it is sponsored by the city of Topeka. because the city of Topeka recognized that the value in it, not just in cultural pride, but actual dollars, right? People come, former community members come from all across the country to attend this, California, Texas, Colorado, wherever people have moved, if they've moved away. It also attracts people from across the state and, city for other Topeka citizens who are not Mexican as well. Next slide, please. But there were also, in response to, the African American civil rights movement that was going on, or in being inspired by it, students protested as well. And this photo is a walkout of high school students in Kansas City. And they were protesting, lack of curriculum. They wanted to learn about their own history, their own stories. They were protesting stigma. Students were still punished for speaking Spanish in schools, and they were tracked into the vocational track instead of the college track. My dad tells the story where, when he was in high school, he was put in all of these vocational classes, but he wanted to go to college. So he had to fight really hard to get into, physics, into algebra, right? Today in my living room, I have this coffee table that he made in one of his vocational classes, and it's gorgeous, right? He could have done anything, and he did, and because he stood up for himself, because his parents couldn't do it. They were monolingual Spanish speakers, right? He had to speak up for himself. He went on to college. He graduated with a degree in physics, I might add. And one of the first jobs he had was working for NASA, right, in the 1960s. So all of these walkouts, these protests, they occurred in colleges, in high schools and colleges across the country. This one, as I mentioned, was from Kansas City. It happened in Topeka. It happened in Wichita. It happened in Texas. Probably the most famous is in Los Angeles. Also, college groups formed. Here in Topeka, there was a group called the Latin American Student Service Organization. They supported Hispanic and Latino students and gave back to the Topeka Mexican community. They hosted Mexican movies in Spanish at a local theater at K-State. There was another, Kansas State University, there was another organization, and they hosted a conference for Latino high school students to get them to go to high school, promoted pride, get them to go to college, promoted pride in culture, had speakers from all around the country, brought in some people from California who had worked with Cesar Chavez at the time, and next slide, please. In the early 1970s, Topeka also founded its own chapter of the League of United Latin American Citizens, which, you remember from the very beginning of my talk, was founded in Corpus Christi, Texas in 1929. In 1970s, Topeka brought their own chapter. My parents and grandparents were some of the founding members of this. And one of the things that they focused on was establishing a senior center for elders in the community, because, as I mentioned, a lot of them are monolingual Spanish speakers, isolated, didn't know what services might be available to them. The senior center is still open, just celebrated its 50th anniversary. This LULAC chapter also started an educational center to encourage high school students to attend college, help them fill out applications, help them, apply for scholarships, for funding, gave suggestions on, what classes they might want to take, what they might want to major in. That organization eventually spread across the state. It's still in existence today, 50 years later. And so, the fight is still going on. This resistance, this celebration of culture, this desire for education, for good jobs, that sort of thing, is still going on. So I will end it right there. And if you have any questions, just feel free to put them in the chat, or if there are any questions in the room. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Mendoza. I think we should just start with Clinton, bring them into the stream, and let me make sure they can hear me. Okay, and then we'll take their questions first. Brian, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yeah. Dr. Mendoza, can you talk a little bit more about, you mentioned the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was the precedent that was used to determine that those Mexican Americans were considered white. Can you kind of elaborate more about that?
Yeah. So I wish I had a map for you all and make it a little easier to explain. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the war between Mexico and the United States, 1846 to 1848, and in that treaty, Mexico ceded about half of its territory to the United States, and that territory would eventually become the states of Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, a little bit of Colorado, a little bit of Kansas, a little bit of Utah, Nevada. And in those lands, there were Mexican citizens already living there, right? So the question became, are these people Mexican or are they American now because they're, in what is now American territory, And so actually the treaty gave them a certain amount of time to decide, those people that were living in these areas. They're like, you can, either leave where you're currently living, in places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and come back to Mexico, and we'll welcome you with open arms, or you can stay and we will consider you United States citizens. Now, the question became, if you're a United States citizen and you stay, which most people did because they, that's where they had been living, for generations, and they had property and they had, had livelihoods. How are we going to classify you? Because this is, our history at this time, right? Very black and white country. And so that actually became a contentious part of negotiating this treaty, how to classify Mexican citizens who were living in this area, but then would become United States citizens. And after a lot of wrangling, it was decided that these because many of them were also of Spanish descent, that they would be classified as white according to the United States. Where we and a lot of other countries, Mexico being one of them, are obsessed with color, right? And so that's kind of how that came about. And so when this incident came up with the students and reached that level, that's the precedent that they went to.
So,
Start
And-
again, Brian.
yeah, the interesting thing as Dr. Mendoza is telling this, I think about the 14th Amendment, and the treaty is before the 14th Amendment and citizenship, and how the 14th Amendment gets kind of retroactively applied to these citizens to give them status as white Americans, where the 14th Amendment is at the heart of the Brown decision, in 1954. So it's really interesting, the parallels and the the ambiguity with that piece of language that gave some rights to some, and but not for years for citizens there in Kansas and across the country with Brown. So thank you. I thank you for sharing that, because that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, it gets even more interesting if you look at the census, the United States Census, because lots of times in the census when it's being taken, in the race category, Mexicans are often listed as Mexican and not white. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. It just depends on who's taking, what the census taker was. So that's also kind of interesting.
I also think that there's a lot of Native American mixture. So that was the main thing, because
Yes.
Native Americans were considered white.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I think that's what we have right now, Joy, from here, but we'll stay on the ready.
Okay. I wanted to ask about, well, maybe comment. So while we were planning this, one of the people I reached out to was Sylvia Mendez, to see if she would be able to take part in this. And I'm thinking about that Kansas students were able to go because they decided they were white. And Sylvia Mendez talks about how in California, there were Mexican schools, but at some point she had cousins who looked more white, and they were able to go to the white school, whereas she and her more darker skinned cousins were had to go to the Mexican school. Did that happen here as well here in Kansas and really anywhere?
Yeah, absolutely. And, Sylvia Mendez was in California, and because there were so many Mexican students in California, they didn't have white and black schools. They had white Mexican schools. Right. But yes, I think Sylvia's cousin that you mentioned, who was lighter skinned, also had a more ambiguous last name. I think it was more French sounding, so it wasn't that telltale Mendez or Mendoza or Gomez, right? That classified you as being Mexican. So that was another thing. And actually color was part of the Alvarado issue as well. Some of those 4 students were darker than others, and I think had they not been united as a group, that the lighter ones might have been able to pass, right? And it would have been okay for them to be there, but because the parents and the children were a unit, basically, that eventually kept all of them out. Have another question in the room, so hold on while we're getting the mic over there.
As I walk over to that, I do also want to ask, with that color division, part of the Underground Railroad went actually into Mexico, and so a lot of former enslaved persons moved to Mexico, married citizens or Mexicans, and so is that part of that colorism, that aspect of light dark skinned Mexicans in California, the fact that they may be black?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there were slaves in Mexico too, right? And then, even if you go back all the way to the Spanish and the North Africans, the Moors, right, who came into Spain, there was that mixing there. When we had my family's DNA down there, there's a lot of, not a lot, but there's a significant portion of African ancestry in my family as well. And so, yes, I think that does, contribute to the gradations of color, if you will. And in going back to Sylvia Mendez, in her case, I can't remember which parent it was, but one of her parents was Puerto Rican. And so if you think about the history of Puerto Rico, sugar plantations and that sort of thing, a lot of slavery there. So she and her family were definitely darker. But question.
And she almost asked the question I wanted to know, but because there were some kids, like you said, the 4 kids that could pass. Did that situation cause a friction in the Mexican community that the darker skin and the lighter skin there was friction there, and is that friction still there?
Oh, absolutely. Yes and yes. Mexican society and Mexican American society, definitely that color gradation, and in New Mexico, for example, there are still people there who will refer to themselves as Hispano, and not, because there's such a significant Spanish ancestry there, so they wouldn't even consider themselves, Mexican. And Mexico as a country itself, at least back in the colonial period, had several different names for color gradations, color mixtures, right? Mestizo and the mulatto also, so yeah, definite colorism in those cultures, and still today. Yeah, I mean, if you watch Spanish language television, telenovelas, who are all the actors? They are white-skinned, light-skinned, blonde. Yeah.
So you just said something that made me think. We talked, and I'm from Florida, and so in Florida we have lots of Latinx people from all across communities, right? All across all countries. And you talked about Sylvia Mendez, one of her parents being from Puerto Rico. Though this case is specifically, or these cases are specifically about Mexican Americans, were they applied to other Spanish-speaking Latinx people from different countries?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even today, right? And I think it's for one, it depends on where you are, but for the most part, everybody's going to be lumped together as Mexican, whether they're from Guatemala, El Salvador, Uruguay. You will be thought of as Mexican, right? Which is a detriment, right? Because it's erasing some of their culture. So that's one thing. But two, I think there's also a prejudice against people who speak another language, and maybe especially if that's their only language they speak, Spanish in this case. So that certainly exists, right? You could be denied a job. Oh, I can't understand what you're saying. I had a relative who married into our family who was from Colombia, and she did not like to speak in public. She had her husband do it or her children do it, if she was at the store or, out and about, because she was embarrassed by, that people might not understand her or by her accent. But she spoke perfect English. I mean, and there was hardly any accent at all, but there was just this stigma inside her, probably from when she was growing up or when she first came to the country, that she couldn't speak well enough. So yeah, I think that these issues occur in other Latinx communities across the country.
Okay, I don't think we have any other questions in the room, do we? I'll check online really quick and double back to Central High School. I said Clinton, but they're at Central today, just to make sure that they don't have any other questions. I don't see any online. Brian, any other questions?
So Brian stepped out. So this is Kathleen.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, one more. Aside from Crown v. Board, what major court cases influence civil rights for Latinx students?
For students. Well, Mendez v. Westminster, as I mentioned, again, that was the state the state level, ended segregation for Mexican students. And I know there was another case, and I can't remember the name of it, that said that students, and it was in Texas, I'm almost positive about that students, even though they weren't citizens, could attend public schools, right? So if you think about Texas in particular, right, and a lot of Mexican immigration coming, across the border, there was an issue of students being denied education because they weren't citizens, right? And again, this is going back to that prejudice. And so there was a case that came about suing to allow non-citizens to attend public school. Yeah. Plyler v. Doe, someone in the room. Thank you so much. So that was another one. Those are the two main ones I can think of off the top of my head regarding schools, but great question, unless Nick has another one.
The only other one that I could think of is, I think it was out of Denver. Now I can't think of the name of the court case too. You might be able to look this up. But I think it was the first time that a desegregation case took place that didn't relate to African-American students. And I want to say it was like in the 70s or something like that. But that's the only other thing that I could really think of where it had a direct tie to Brown v. Board of Education, so rights and public education.
And I think there was another one regarding language issues. That's kind of coming to mind, that students did not have to be taught in English, that they could be taught in their own language as well. Yeah, great question. We'll look these up and send them to Joy, and she can send them out.
All right. Any other questions, Kathleen?
No, we are all set.
All right. Well, then I don't see any online or none in the room. So I will say thank you to Dr. Mendoza. Thank you to everyone for watching and listening. It is lunchtime. So we will take that break and we will meet back here at noon for Cheryl Brown Henderson as our keynote. Like I said, please, as I've been saying, please join us about 5 minutes early, or be ready to join us about 5 minutes early, so that when we can go live right on time. Thank you. And we are ending this stream. So there's a new stream for Cheryl Brown Henderson. So make sure you join that one. Have a good afternoon or a good break.